I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. When things go wrong in business, you need to know what to do and what to say. Our guest this morning has spent her career guiding companies and individuals through crises and through the communication challenges that come with major transactions, from public listings to mergers and corporate downsizing. Sue Cato AM established Cato Council in 2003 and has been going strong ever since. It's since evolved into Cato and Clive with Sue's business partner, Clive Matheson. I wanted to look today at some of the issues confronting Australian businesses and how best to communicate your way through them. Sue, welcome to Fear and Greed.
I'm happy to be here, Sean.
How did you get interested in corporate comms to begin with?
It actually wasn't corporate comms at the beginning. It was working in politics, and I was active from quite a young age, working on campaigns and elections, and so it evolved. So I was working with journos, in the press gallery and on the streets, sort of dealing with things like that. And I quite frankly didn't know what public relations was or what corporate communications was. For me, it was just working with journos.
Okay, quite remarkable that 18 years' time you are the leader in corporate communications and public relations, I would suggest. Why have you been so successful? You and I have known each other for a long time and we've sort of dealt with each other on both sides of the fence. You have an incredible client list. How have you done that? How have you kept them?
Well, Sean, thanks. First of all, that's a very generous description, and I suspect there are many, even perhaps me, who might take tackle with it. But look, I think having a grounding in politics was very helpful. It allowed you to take information on board with the fire hose, if you like. It helped you actually identify what the real problem was, as distinct from where the noise was. You're always looking around yourself and obviously, protecting your back, but you were certainly trying to have a view of one step forward. So you ultimately had to work hard, had to work fast, had to become a master of your subject. Sometimes too quickly, as we've seen in politics, but that was the job, to sound like you knew what you were actually talking about. And I think that grounding has been helpful. And I find, many in our line of business have politics one way or another in their background.
And you also work incredibly hard. How many hours a week do you work, Sue?
Hate to think, Sean, it's an early start in the morning. And as we all know, the rhythm of life and business doesn't actually have a clock. So you're on call and you're working as you need to.
Okay, so let's start with crises and issues management. What's the biggest crisis you've ever dealt with?
Look, it always feels like the one you're in at the moment. I think actually a new bar was set. There's one thing dealing with corporate issues and, you're always wanting to look after and ensure that shareholders' interests and companies' interests and employees' interests are looked after. But high watermark.
Low watermark, perhaps.
Yeah, well, during the onset of COVID, I had a client who had a ship stuck off Uruguay with COVID positive cases on board. And that became urgent because we needed to get them home. But the thing that made it different was we were actually really dealing with people's lives.
Yeah.
So, waking up at sort of 4:00 in the morning and hoping that everybody was okay and had got through the night gave you a different perspective. And, I think anyone who actually deals in, literally life and death, whether they're doctors, nurses, or, anyone in a profession, or, police, ambulance drivers, etc. It is just a totally different type of concern.
Yeah, I remember getting very panicked about certain stories that we were running in different times when I was at Fairfax. The editor-in-chief of the Financial Review, a guy called Michael Stutchbury, who you know well, Sue, He used to have this saying, he used to just sort of say, look, no one died. And it was a bit of a throwaway line, but in a sense, mostly what you do in business journalism, what you do every day, Sue, no one does die at the end. It hurts people certainly, and individuals get impacted and share prices get impacted. But that example you gave, it must be a real eye-opener when you're literally talking about people's lives.
And we had the complexities because at that stage, there hadn't been any mass movements of people who were COVID positive around the world. So working with, governments and embassies, and you can just imagine the layers of complexity that the team were involved in was quite extraordinary and quite a feat when the passengers and crew, as many as possible, that we did get them home. I remember in the beginning of COVID, everyone was saying that they were bored. and nothing to do, and it was dull. And I've got to say, the whole of that COVID year was extraordinary from our end.
Okay. Now, bringing it back home, what do you think are the big issues facing corporate Australia at the moment, the things that you're called in to assist with?
Look, the one that's obviously focusing people right now and is highly topical is workplace culture. And that is saying that whether that be in politics or corporations, there has been less and less tolerance for, shall we say, substandard behaviour. But right now it's incredibly acute, which is a good thing. But it just means that the focus is on it, and hopefully we will get change. But, that's a big deal. The markets are obviously really interesting at the moment. And geopolitics, if you're a company that's trying to sell or was selling product into China, I mean, those are major issues. There's a whole gamut of things. And the other thing, Sean, without sounding too trite, is people are incredibly grumpy at the moment. People are really punchy.
You haven't ever been grumpy in your life. How would you know what grumpy was?
Well, when you're on the receiving end of it.
I suppose so.
But if you think about it, whether it's in traffic or, somebody accidentally bumps into somebody or actually gets ahead of somebody in a queue, in a supermarket, normally you just go, yeah, whatever. Whereas now people will actually call it out. And I think seeing that in business, so whether it's proxy advisors, being cross about things, or shareholders being cross, or fundies, etc., biffo in a corporate environment, everyone's got a short leash. And I don't think the recent Easter break actually helped.
Sue, stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Sue Cato, partner at corporate communications firm Cato and Clive. Is a lot of the stuff you do, and we're talking about, if we bring it back to the workplace culture example, trying to keep stuff out of the limelight?
Look, that's a highly topical question, Sean. Really, really topical, because there's a big push right now for companies not to impose non-disclosure agreements when they're settling workplace issues, so that the victim, if you like, or the person who's been on the receiving end, if they choose to tell their story, they can. So you've got that on one side. And, for corporations who are wanting stuff to disappear and go away, that's obviously quite confronting. But you've also got the situation where the person who has been, for want of a better word, wronged, some of them wanted to disappear as well. Some of them they want to be able to make a complaint or make an exit, or suggest that somebody else exits a business without it being career-ending. So it's highly, highly topical. And there are some corporations that realise that the only way that there will be change is if people within the business see that they are prepared to tackle issues and be open and honest and transparent about it, so that it gives people the strength internally to think that if they do want to talk about stuff, that they will be heard, they will be taken seriously, and it will be acted on.
The great example last year, of course, was AMP and AMP Capital, and promoting an individual, Bo Pahari, to a job where it emerged later on that he had allegedly behaved inappropriately to a female employee. The flip side to that was QBE, which had a CEO who allegedly behaviour towards an employee wasn't appropriate. In those two cases, AMP fought it, for want of a better phrase, and QBE's immediately got rid of its CEO. Is it as easy as saying that's what you've got to do? Because there must be so many shades of grey in these areas. And I'm not particularly picking on AMP here, because I'm sure lots of big organisations have similar issues.
Look, if something obvious isn't being done, my general rule of thumb is that there's a reason.
Yeah.
While in a listed environment, corporations really understand, or generally understand, their disclosure obligations. They understand the need to, have strong cultures. But, in all sorts of circumstances, and often for me, actually, and I will answer the question, I promise, Sean, but often to me, when I'm watching odd things happening, I'm actually more interested in why the obvious thing isn't happening and why odd things are happening. Because generally there's a reason. And that to me is the interesting thing. Because if somebody's doing something, that's, shall we say, untoward, inappropriate, etc., and it's not immediately acted upon, you just think, why not?
And most corporations and boards are very savvy about the need to keep an eye on it and actually want to do the right thing, I would argue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think boards feel a real responsibility to be the cultural leaders in their respective businesses. And with the greater diversity emerging on boards, that's ultimately a good thing for culture across the board. And that's diversity, not just men and women, it's age, it's backgrounds, it's experience, it's the full gamut.
How do you deal with or talk to boards and CEOs of listed companies when things leak? Because inevitably they do leak, and there's always examples of that. And of course, they've got continuous disclosure responsibilities as well. How important is it that companies are proactive in confronting some of these issues publicly rather than trying to ignore them?
Often it's not a case that they're trying to ignore them. Often it's a case of trying to work situations through. So say, for instance, if there are negotiations going on, there are contracts being negotiated or, deeds of separation being negotiated, these aren't things that you can do, minute by minute, updates and tweets about. So sometimes things take longer than you'd like them to take. Sometimes they just take too long, full stop.
Yep.
But there are some things that are absolutely cut and dried. My advice always is, even if the right thing is incredibly hard, if it's the right thing, you've got to do it. You've got to make the tough decision, because generally when you see major stuff-ups, it's when people are, to your point, trying to avoid it or trying to delay it. And generally the cleanup and the sorting of problems out takes 5 times longer than actually if they dealt with it as quickly as they could.
Yeah, okay. We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm talking to Sue Cato, partner at corporate communications firm Cato Clive. Do you like journalists?
I've got enormous respect for lots of journalists. There are one or two that are a bit scratchy, but that's just a human condition, I suspect. I don't know how many journos like what we all do, but I think, if you treat everyone with respect, and, we're all humans after all, generally they're good. And also some of the journos, and Sean, you know this, having been an editor, having been a superb journo for years and years and years, sometimes people forget the bravery of journalists when they're out there day in, day out, putting their name to a story, knowing that they're making people cross, asking the hard questions, the questions that people don't want asked. It's the old shining the light. There are some journos who, you and I both know, who have put themselves in harm's way to actually do their job, and I have enormous respect for that.
Yeah. The two things I think I've learned about journalism since leaving journalism is that, and the other part is how difficult it is for a journalist to get a full story, because they're always being told a side of a story. And sometimes they get 2 sides of the story, but as you've sort of alluded to this whole conversation, there's always so much to a story that ends up on the front page of the Financial Review or the Australian or in the ABC News Bulletin. And it's really hard for journalists, I think, to actually get the whole gamut of the story.
And look, and sometimes it's not because they're not being told. Sometimes it's that the person or the people who are telling the story actually themselves obviously can't see it from every single angle. You've got to see, you'll be seeing it through your own lens. So it's often not a case of people trying to mislead or shall we say be a little brief in their storytelling. It's just sometimes incredibly hard.
Do you enjoy your job?
Yep. I wouldn't do it if I didn't. I have, there are some days that are more enjoyable than others, but fixing things or sorting stuff out is something that I really value.
In my dealings with you over the years, Sue, you are so well connected, from bureaucrats to politicians and senior business leaders. Do you occasionally come across the outstanding leader, and the flip side is occasionally come across the one that you think they're not so hot?
I've got to say, I have been incredibly lucky in my life to work with and hopefully learn from some extraordinary people right across the gamut of business and politics. And it's actually one of the blessings of my job, is actually being able to meet some extraordinary individuals. And, it's, obviously not naming names, but there are some people who I think about often about just their honour, their truth, etc., their just sheer brain power and their goodness, and that, working with many clients, we get to see a lot of people, and there are some extraordinary humans out there. And there are some humans out there that are probably not people I'd want to have a glass of wine with.
That was Sue Cato, partner at corporate communications firm Cato Clive.